Welcome and thank you to everyone for attending the webinar today. I am excited to share with you the results of the work that I have been doing over the last several months with scientists and Xerces staff. And I think you'll see at the end of this talk that we have some challenges ahead of us, but we also have many opportunities as well for combined conservation of some of our most imperiled Western butterfly species. There we go. For those of you who might be less familiar with the Xerces Society's work, we are a nonprofit organization that protects wildlife through the conservation of invertebrates and their habitats. And we've been doing that for just over 50 years. We're in our 50th year celebration. Our work is divided into 4 main program areas. We have a native pollinator program that works largely with farmers and other landowners to conserve and enhance native pollinator and beneficial insect habitat. We have an endangered species program that I am part of that has focal areas including not only the wider diversity of butterflies, but especially monarchs, as well as bumblebees, fireflies, and aquatic invertebrates. We have a pesticide reduction team who works to create content for protecting pollinators and advocates for pollinator protection practices in the pesticide arena. And we have a great community engagement team that not only creates their own wonderful content, but also helps us reach out to the public and reach stakeholders of all kinds who support insect conservation. And our staff use a variety of strategies to achieve our goals in these program areas. We use a lot of scientific research, including management studies, species surveys. We have an education and training component, including webinars like this, workshops, and community science programs like our Bumblebee Atlases. We use the best science available to advocate for policy that protects pollinators and supports invertebrate conservation. And we work on restoration and applied conservation, including our habitat kits, which are available in California and Santa Fe areas. And we work with landowners and farmers to achieve management practices that protect local pollinators there. One of my favorite parts about working for Xerxes is our large and well-curated selection of publications. I have here some of the publications that I think are perhaps most useful based on the content of my talk today. But there are many others that are available at the website listed there. I would like to point out especially these 2 bottom right and bottom left books that I think are especially pertinent here today. And we complete all of this work by being a donor-supported nonprofit. So we would encourage you, if you are interested in the work we're doing and would like to support it, to please visit the website listed here and sign up to be a supporter of our work and our staff. And you can also get that beautiful pollinator habitat sign at the same time. And with that, we'll move in to our discussion on the state of butterflies in the West. And butterflies are an important part of Western insect communities and of Western ecosystems. Not only are they perhaps most commonly known to us as frequent flower visitors and sometimes pollinators of many Western plants, but they're also a huge component of the prey diets for many different types of birds, other vertebrates like reptiles and amphibians, as well as a huge number of larger invertebrate species that feed on caterpillars and small butterflies as well. But perhaps their most important role in general as an ecological being is that of an herbivore. I have one of my favorite pictures that I found on the internet of a Indra swallowtail caterpillar, just colored neon there. And you can tell maybe that that caterpillar is a fair size, and being that size, that caterpillar is going to eat a lot of the wild lomatium plants that it feeds on, and all of the native plants that you see outside are controlled in one way or another by herbivorous plants, and caterpillars are an important component of that. Many groups of insects have high levels of diversity, that is, high numbers of species in the Western United States, and butterflies are no exception to this. Texas has the highest number of species, partly because of going so far south in latitude, but you can see the large numbers of species that can be found throughout the desert Southwest. especially in Arizona and New Mexico, but in many other portions of the West as well. Within these numbers of different species in different states and regions, some taxonomic groups, that is some different levels of biology, whether I'm talking about a family of butterflies or a particular group within that. Some taxonomic groups are very, very diverse. So for example, one genus of butterflies in the lycaenid family that we typically call the blues. I have an example on the top right that's a ruddy blue, delicately laying an egg on a buckwheat flower. There are 17 species of Euphalotes with over 50 named subspecies in the Western US, according to one of the typical descriptions of butterfly diversity. So very, very diverse. And Southwest skippers are incredibly diverse. Skippers are a group of butterflies in the family Hesperiidae, and there are 110 species of skippers in New Mexico alone. So huge amounts of diversity. These butterflies span the gamut as far as being generalists, which means that their caterpillars can eat many different types of plants. And I'll try and use the term caterpillar food plants when I am talking about the plants that caterpillars have to eat. I may sometimes slip up and refer to those as host plants. That's the other common name for those. Some butterflies are generalists. Their caterpillars can eat many kinds of host plants, and some butterflies are extreme specialists, meaning their caterpillars must eat only one or two different species of plants. Some of these butterflies have very narrow distributions. I might call those endemic species because they're very narrowly distributed. Others have very broad distributions spanning the entire Western United States or even a larger portion of the country. The Four Corners states that we're going to highlight today are as fine a place as any to highlight Western butterfly diversity for a number of reasons, some of which are political and some of which are ecological. As you can see in this map, where green is US Forest Service, brown is Bureau of Land Management, salmon color is Fish and Wildlife Service, and the gold is National Park Service land, you can see there's a wide variety of public land ownerships, as well as they're intermixed with a huge amount of privately owned land. If we skip to this somewhat kaleidoscope looking like figure of the ecological regions of the Four Corners and Intermountain West area, you can see that there is a huge amount of ecological variation in this region, including isolated mountain ranges and fragile, narrow riparian areas. There are large sand dune habitats that are host to a large number of endemic plant and insect communities. There have been huge increases in the human population in many of the metropolitan areas across the West, and the rural areas are subject to a huge variety of land uses, often simultaneously, including energy development, recreation, and livestock grazing. So typically, when butterflies were found to be threatened by one of the things that we've just mentioned, or are vulnerable because of their geographic isolation or other ecological characteristics, traditional butterfly conservation has focused on localized subspecies or species, and I've listed a few of them here, and in the top right is a photo of the Shriver's elfin, found on the Colorado Front Range and threatened by the development that occurs up and down there, both from urban development and agriculture. And then there are also a set of species that we tend to protect because they are habitat specialists. And so I've listed there two skippers that are federally protected, that have fairly broad geographic distributions, but still are found only in Midwestern grasslands, which is a very vulnerable and threatened habitat. Then another example of butterfly conservation that has had a lot of attention lately is the monarch butterfly, which again is a very broadly distributed butterfly, but yet is still somewhat of a habitat specialist because it feeds only on plants in the genus Asclepias that we know as milkweeds. So kind of a mix of those two. These species of concern are monitored and protected by several agencies, depending on the land that they are found on and the authority that that agency has. And those agencies can include state departments of wildlife in some instances, as well as the Bureau of Land Management, the US Forest Service, and then of course the Endangered Species Act is regulated by the US Fish and Wildlife Service and NOAA as well. And then one other organization that I like to mention when it comes to monitoring imperiled species and subspecies as the organization NatureServe. They assign conservation status ranks to plants and animals based on their level of imperilment, and they have a rank calculator that they use to do that. And I'll be referring to some of their data later on. However, research on the threats that insects face today paints a picture of widespread threats that often occur over a wide range in geographic area. And insects today will often face multiple threats at one time, and even widespread species can be subjected to threats that put them in peril across their entire range. So this is a large concern that suggests we may have to shift our focus of conservation efforts from these narrow threats, these localized threats, to things that are more widely distributed. And what makes this situation slightly worse is the fact that long-term data on abundances of different species in different areas to predict population viability, that is to understand if a population is in decline or not, these data are typically very scarce in most insect species. However, the bright side of this is that while many types of insects do appear to be threatened and in decline, not just butterflies, butterfly taxonomy in the Western US is relatively understood compared to things like native bees, which are so extraordinarily diverse and understudied. And there are some long-term data available thanks to a long legacy of appreciation of these insects. And I have shown two of the individuals here that are responsible for collecting or maintaining the data sets that I'm going to talk about in just a minute here. On the top right is Art Shapiro. He's a professor at the University of California, Davis, and he has the longest running butterfly survey in North America. He has monitored several sites across the central corridor of California, including the Coast Range and the Sierra Nevadas, every 2 weeks since the 1970s and 80s. And then on the bottom right is Jeffrey Glassberg. He's the executive director of the North American Butterfly Association, or NABA, and he is responsible for maintaining a database of 4th of July butterfly counts, which are analogous, if any of you are familiar with Christmas bird counts, to a once a year intense abundance and diversity count of butterflies at a given site. So this data was recently published in an analyzed format by Matt Forrester, who is a past PhD student of Art Shapiro's and current professor at the University of Nevada in Reno. And the results that he found were not encouraging, and they were not different than many other butterfly studies in the United States that have come out in recent times. Perhaps what's most striking about this study is its geographic breadth, the ability of it to reach all Western states in its analysis, as well as its taxonomic scope, looking at so many different species at once. And I'll show you that these are the 3 data sets that are used. This is the Art Shapiro data set in California. Those of you that are familiar with California might recognize this pathway as the Interstate 80 corridor. And the colors of all of these dots are coded by elevation. These are the sites that are monitored that had long enough term data to be used in this analysis by the North American Butterfly Association. And you can see they are scattered throughout the Western US. And these are the states, as well as Alaska, that I focused on for my analysis well. So we're looking from New Mexico northward and westward, and I included Alaska in my work as well. And then he also used iNaturalist data as well, which you can see there are many, many observations. The results of this found that there was a 1.6% per year compounded decline in butterfly abundance in this study. And this graph here shows the population trajectory of the some of the species in this study. Anything left of this line is in decline. Anything to the right of it is increasing in population size. And you can see that there are a wide number, up to 80% of the widespread species were in decline. There were about 165 species used in this study, measured in this study. The declines in this study were found to be associated mainly with increased warming and drying, especially warming in the autumn season. And they didn't look at effects that this has, but it was hypothesized, and other studies have investigated the effects of drying and warming on the caterpillar food plants that are available, as well as the adult nectar plants that are available, and the butterfly and caterpillar physiology itself. Matt is continuing this research, and we're collaborating with him on a publication that's currently in final stages of preparation to take this work and turn it into a more species-specific ranked analysis of which butterfly species are most at risk based on different types of data that are available. And so for the species that have these long-term count data, which are, again, about 170 of the very widely distributed Western butterflies, Matt has completed population viability analyses for those of various kinds. For species without the long-term data, of which there are another few hundred, he has used a range of ecological correlates and range size attributes to analyze which species are most at risk due to climate change, drought, development, and other threats. And I just want to show you the results of this work for a little bit, because they are going to inform what I do for the rest of this talk. And the main result from this study reinforces the finding that large numbers of widespread species are in evident decline based on these long-term count data. You can see at this number 31 down here is the monarch butterfly. All of these species are in rates of decline based on long-term count data that appear to be very, very similar to that of the monarch. The exact rank of these may be slightly less important because there are large margins of error. This is just for a little bit of context to this crazy graph. This is their ranking, and then there is a margin of error in parentheses next to it. And you can see that the margins of error are very large. That does not take away from the fact that all of these species appear to be in steep decline. It does also somewhat disturbingly reassure us that monarch butterfly populations in the summertime appear to be in similar rates of decline to those of the wintering counts. Just as a reminder, the monarch migratory pattern means that all of our wintertime counts are happening when the monarchs are not reproducing but are staying dormant for the wintertime. And these counts that we're looking at here are looking at counts during their summering, their breeding time in the summer. The third finding is that there really is a high concentration of endemic species in the desert Southwest that are at risk, and I'm going to highlight some of those in a bit. And most of these are going to be skippers, which I have already mentioned. So the first portion then of my real work was to take this ranking that Matt has produced and incorporate it with other existing conservation information. And to do this, we use the great work by the NatureServe organization and their many dedicated state natural heritage partners. And so the very broad outline of what I did was I took those individual ranks that Matt had produced, and I made my own ranking system based off of the NatureServe ranks. And NatureServe, I'll show you a little bit. NatureServe ranks species at the global, national, and state levels. And I combined these different rankings together in a weighted system so that I was able to make a similar analysis to what Matt did using count data. And I have done something slightly analogous to make a weighted ranking system off of NatureServe ranks and state ranks as well. And the results of this, again, reinforce the imperilment of desert Southwest species. NatureServe ranks tended to, there were many species in the Southwest that were vulnerable to various threats, and these are reinforced by by them being threatened by drought and warming in the Southwest. The second, and also you can note the number of, the large number of Hesperiids or skippers, which are colored in yellow here. And again, the second finding is that the monarch is only one of many widespread species in decline that appear to be threatened by multiple ongoing processes. So this is a slightly different view of the ranks, looking at widespread species with count data. And this is their absolute rank in my system here on the left. And you can see that the monarch is fairly far down. There are 29 other species ranked above it in our combined system here. So there are many other species that we also need to share our concern with. And then lastly, these widespread species were often not ranked as being vulnerable by NatureServe and state partners. And I would tend to believe that this is because the threats that they are subjected to are not as well defined as for those that are species that are narrowly distributed. So to begin with a more detailed look at some of the most imperiled taxa on our list, I would first like to highlight something I've already mentioned a couple times, which is the high number of skipper species that can be found in the desert Southwest, especially in the mountains of Arizona and New Mexico. And so I have a small sampling of some of the top species from that previous ranking list. These two species here are different species of giant skipper, and those feed on the agave plants. They feed on distinct species of agave. Each one of these feeds on different species of agave. The other 6 species are all grass feeders, which is somewhat common in the skipper family. And their skippers sometimes get a bad rap because of their diversity and because they are fairly small and fairly fast and sometimes fairly similar looking. So you might consider this a crash course in skipper diversity, but I think the real point of this picture is that there are some very, very gorgeous skippers out there, not the least of which is the southern skipperling here, which is the smallest skipper in North America. So I wanted just to give you a sense of where these butterflies are located and give you a sense for the combined opportunity for conservation. These records are from the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, which is abbreviated GBIF. So it's not a complete set of records for these species. I've just used them as a sampling to show you their distribution. And you can see that they are clustered around the junction of Mexico, New Mexico, and Arizona. And they're largely in mid-elevation open woodlands. So the threats that they face because of this shared habitat, and many of them also share an overlapping flight phenology, or the time that they are adults flying around, the threats that they face are very similar. And these are threats that are probably recognizable to those of you in this area, including grazing, drought, changes in the fire regime, and species in this area, because it tends to be fairly rural, often lack monitoring data. Again, as I mentioned, most of these species that I've listed here are grass feeders and 2 agave feeders, which means during restoration and during habitat protection, we have a large opportunity to protect multiple species at one time just by protecting a given habitat. The next set of species that I would like to highlight are a totally different set of characteristics. These are all widespread species that have been found to be in decline based on the long-term monitoring data that I have been talking about. And these butterflies have characteristics that make them more amenable to restoration over a larger area. So I'm going to take some time and explain each of these species to you, give you a little bit of a background on them. And then after I've done that, I'm going to talk about some of the shared conservation opportunities that we have for them. The first butterfly that I want to highlight is the WestCoast Lady. The WestCoast Lady is renowned for being found in gardens, yards, and other urban areas. It's also commonly found around agricultural edges, and it's found in natural wet meadows and near riparian areas. It is a butterfly that in the southern parts of California, as well as southern Arizona and New Mexico, can be found as an adult all year round, as well as caterpillars and pupae all year round. And then throughout the year, it tends to colonize inland and upland areas throughout the summertime. So if you live in an area that's more mountainous in a place like Colorado or in inland Washington, you may not expect to see this butterfly until mid to late summer. And then these bubbles on here are showing similar things. The orange dots are point records, and the purple dots underneath are county level records. And all of these maps are going to come from the website that is the Butterflies and Moths of North America, which is a wonderfully curated site. The last bits on this graph that I want to explain, because you're going to see several of them, are examples of populations in decline to help me make my case. And in this case, I am using only examples from Art Shapiro's data in California. I recognize that this is a Four Corners talk. You will have to trust me and take me at my word that I am not cherry picking this data. The other data that are available, we are respecting co-authors' wishes to wait to show that until the publication has been reviewed and published. But these data that I'm showing you from California have a history of being used in many peer-reviewed publications and are available for use now. This graph here are the different sites that a species was found at, and they are color-coded to what I'm going to show you on the right. So as an example, this is the West Sacramento and North Sacramento sites that you're looking at here. And then I'll reveal the rest. And these graphs here show how often Art was able to find this particular species of butterfly throughout the entire season. So if the bubble is near 1, it means he saw it every single time he went out, 100% of the time. If he never saw it in a given season, the bubble would be at 0. And if over the course of the season he saw it every other time, the bubble would be at 0.5. So as you can see, the West Sacramento and North Sacramento sites have taken this, have shown this butterfly to go from being a very, very common butterfly that you might see every single time that you visited the site to a butterfly that in recent years he has seen almost never. And then if I reveal the rest of the sites that the West Coast Lady is found at, you can see that this is happening across its range in Central California, going from a very, very common butterfly to a very, very uncommon butterfly, a situation that is not unlike that of the monarch butterfly. The West Coast Lady feeds on plants in the mallows and the stinging nettle family. So I have listed some of these here. It's part of what makes this butterfly such a habitat generalist is that some of its plants are in somewhat dry areas like low mallows. Some of its plants are in somewhat wet areas like checker mallows. Some of its plants are in very disturbed areas like cheeseweed and weedy mallows that you might be familiar with from your yard. And some of them are in disturbed and wet areas like stinging nettle. So this butterfly truly can be found in a huge variety of habitats, feeding on a wide number of plants, even though it can only eat plants from these two families. The second and third butterflies that I'm going to focus on are a little bit different in their distributions. They're both middle to upper elevation woodland species, especially this one, the Nevada cloudy wing. You, if you are familiar with butterflies, may have known this as the Mexican cloudy wing, but those two species were recently separated. So the things that are in the United States are considered the Nevada cloudy wing that I have listed here. You can see it's a middle to high elevation species based on where Art Shapiro found it as his site, excuse me. And you can see that this butterfly is also in steady decline, at least in 2 sites and potentially at the 3rd site that it can be found at. And this pattern, again, is replicated in other sites that have long-term monitoring data available. And you'll be able to see that when this publication is published. The Nevada cloudy wing feeds on plants in the Fabaceae family, which are legumes, and especially it is known for feeding on clovers and close relatives. So this, even though these are definitely woodland riparian species, you may be familiar with clovers from a number of environments that are partially disturbed, sometimes half in the sun, sometimes in the shade, and can be near disturbed areas that we may have vegetation management strategies in place. So we'll be talking about that more in the future. Oh, I should mention also that this butterfly is an adult usually during June and July. And the males are found perching on small rocks and stumps waiting for females to fly by. So that's often where you'll find them. The common roadside skipper is another skipper butterfly that is usually an adult between May and July, depending on the exact habitat that it's found in. You can see that it is fairly absent from most of the Great Basin, but it's common throughout California, the upper Northwest, and then through the Rocky Mountain states as well. It is another middle elevation woodland species. You can see the 3 sites that it's found on the west side of the Sierras in Art Shapiro's data set. And you can see those data here. It is never an exceedingly common species, but something that is regularly seen throughout the season and is in decline in these regions. As I said, this butterfly is found on woodland edges and usually near stream sides, and it's a grass feeder, as other skippers that I've mentioned are. You can see some of those examples here. You may notice that some of these are not native grasses, and that is somewhat common in skippers, that you will see them be able to feed on many grasses, both natives and non-native. The last skipper in your crash course of skippers, again, is the common sooty wing. The common sooty wing has another common name, that is the roadside rambler, which I think is very descriptive. It's typically found along disturbed sites. So this can be mainly because of the places where its host plants grow, which I will talk about. It can be found anywhere from vacant lots and industrial areas to agricultural edges. And then in more natural habitats, it's found in disturbed areas like the edges of sandy washes and seasonal streams. In the southern parts of its range, it can be found between February and late October, or even November as an adult. But in the inner portions of its range, it's found mainly from April or May through September. You can see the sites, the low elevation sites that it's found at in Art Shapiro's data set. This is a low elevation butterfly. And you can see the state of its decline at those sites on the right, going from a butterfly that you might see every other time that you went out to visit to something that has been extirpated at 2 or possibly 3 of its 5 locations in Central California. This butterfly, as I mentioned, feeds on plants that thrive in disturbed areas. And these are plants in the Amaranth family, or Amaranthaceae. And so I've listed a couple of them here. You may be familiar with amaranths as something that people occasionally cultivate. And one of those is shown here. Many of these amaranths are not native. Some of them are native to the United States. As I've mentioned, it's fairly common for butterflies to use a mix of those. And some of them are very, very common in urban and disturbed edges. And other sets of them are very common in agricultural habitats. And this will come into play when it comes to their conservation. One last butterfly I'm just going to highlight very briefly, partly because I love the caterpillar and partly because it represents a little bit different type of butterfly than some of what I've been talking about, is the Indra swallowtail. As you can see, the butterfly has a fairly broad distribution overall, but is very localized in its occurrences in middle or upper elevation woodland and mountain habitats. And so you can see where it has been found in Art Shapiro's data sets in the high Sierras in Central California there, and you can see its rates of decline there. And this is also echoed in other sites throughout its distribution that we have long-term data for. So something of a different ilk that is still suffering a similar trend. Because of the broad distributions and the range of habitats that these species have, the threats that they face can be similar between them, and they may be facing these threats in broad geographic areas. So the strategies that we might present for their conservation can be used by a large number of people. And I believe that the strategies I'm going to present today should be applicable at any scale, especially because of the broad distribution of these butterflies. And I'm going to highlight how each of these strategies applies to the specific species as I go through them. So I'm going to start through a general outline and then give you more detailed suggestions. The first thing is protecting food plants. Many of these species, just like the monarch and other things we've talked about briefly, they're larval specialists, which means the caterpillars can only eat plants from one or a few different families. And so that needs to be a focal area for us. Also, some of these plant species, and I'll highlight some of them, are even considered pests. You may be familiar with people wanting to remove stinging nettle from a patch of their yard because they do not want it in their yard. And then lastly, some of these plants exist on or near disturbed edges, which may put them at risk for vegetation management or just for generalized disturbance and habitat degradation. The second thing that we can do is to replant these food plants, especially in degraded habitats. Many of these species, because they are somewhat common in urban areas, are dependent on plants to be present in urban areas. And so the less we do, the more danger we put them in. And there are different examples of restoration where this might be important, including post-fire restoration, or in urban or exurban development. And exurban, just as a quick definition, we think about, it might have been called bedroom communities in the past. They're typically Western communities with few or no services, made up mainly of suburban houses that are outside of the city center. The third thing we can do is protect these butterflies from pesticides. As I have already mentioned, many of these species inhabit agricultural and urban edges. And so we want to pay careful attention to the use of systemic herbicides on or near those areas. And I'll highlight some of that. And then the last thing that we can do is protect them from drought. And this, to be sure, is a little bit of a harder challenge to work on a small scale. But I think it means that we should pay attention to the species that we find near water and to pay attention to how permanent that water is, because year-round water will be particularly important in areas where butterflies need nectar plants late into the fall to survive late into the season. So just to briefly go through what this might look like for each of these top widespread taxa, as I've mentioned, the WestCoast Lady uses a large number of host plants that can be found in a wide variety of habitats. So we're going to be looking for those in any number of habitats, and we can put a wide variety of nectar plants out for them because they are not nectar specialists either. They've been documented at flowers of almost every color. The second thing that we can do to reduce pesticide exposure, this butterfly is known to be prevalent at agricultural edges and in urban settings. So in addition to carefully choosing the chemicals that we want to apply in different areas, we can incorporate a host of cultural techniques to avoid the habitats that this butterfly frequents. The third thing, somewhat related, is to protect weedy caterpillar food plants from removal. Weedy mallow in particular is often targeted by homeowners for removal in grass lawns, but it is a very common host plant for this butterfly. And removing the host plant in the center of its life cycle is obviously going to be likely fatal for the caterpillar. And then lastly, supporting refuges during drought. Again, these butterflies are often found in riparian or wet meadow areas. So if we are paying attention to priority sites where we find this butterfly, sites with year-round water may be the highest priority as opposed to sites with only seasonal water that are going to dry up later in the year. The Nevada cloudy wing and the common roadside skipper that I'll talk about next, as they live in different habitats, have slightly different recommendations. Typically, agricultural pesticide exposure and urban pesticide exposure is not as large an issue for them. However, middle elevation woodlands are a very popular area for ex-urban expansion right now. I am in Washoe Valley, Nevada. The Lake Tahoe area is a perfect example of an ex-urban development in many areas. And so protecting these plants, the host plants and butterfly populations from these sorts of disturbances are very important. And as I mentioned, their host plants, while being typical in riparian areas, these riparian areas often abut roadsides or urban development and may be managed for vegetation in a way that would kill these plants off during the middle of a caterpillar growth cycle. Moving on to the roadside skipper, just to give more detailed management guidance for this. As I mentioned, this is a grass feeder. Grasses are wonderful restoration components in post-fire or post-disturbance restoration plantings. They are wonderful drought-tolerant components of native plantings that provide structure for bumblebees, as well as food plants for this caterpillar. And it also will feed on a wide variety of nectar plants, but as you can see in this photo, it does tend to prefer whitish and purplish flowers. And this is another butterfly, especially grasses that may dry out later in the season or early in the summer when this is an adult laying eggs on grasses. Sites that have additional water, some sort of irrigation, things that are on pasture and agricultural edges that are thriving off of that additional water may turn out to be very important sites. And then lastly, the common sooty wing, we have similar strategies for. There are native amaranths and native other chenopods. Goosefoots are their common name. There are native choices to pick from for restoration plantings. Most of these are annuals, so they don't require a lot of extra work to get them to germinate. They just need a slightly disturbed site. Again, this is a butterfly that's common along roadsides, agricultural edges, things that may have additional water feeding the host and nectar plants through the year. These are sites we want to pay attention to. And then lastly, the thing I like to mention are that some of these host plants that this butterfly feeds on in particular are known as somewhat invasive weeds. And just to point one out, the Palmer amaranth, which is a documented host plant for this butterfly, was voted the worst weed in America in 2016 by someone. So it is a plant that is sometimes selected against because of its weediness traits, and we need ways to manage that when we are protecting habitat as well as managing for invasive weeds. So while our work with species had some obvious and interesting conclusions to it, much of the conservation effort that goes on today is focused on subspecies and looking at subspecies that is groups of somewhat isolated populations that are part of the same species, but still ecologically differentiated by one thing or another. Those are often our targets of restoration, and they give a different perspective on the threats that butterflies are facing. So we also wanted to do an analysis of all of the subspecies in Western North America, of which there are just over 1,000. And as you might imagine, long-term data are not available for most of these narrowly distributed taxa. We don't have that sort of data to pull from. So we included some other information this time in addition to state and global and national nature serve ranks. We included a measure of range size, and we included a measure of when they were last observed. You might find it interesting that some of these butterfly subspecies have not been found in quite a long time, and this is just one example taken from a wonderful report, a wonderful publication on the butterflies of the Yosemite region, showing this subspecies of the small blue, Phyllotiella speciosa, that's not been seen. This photo was from, the specimens are from 1970. It's not been seen since 1972. So that, just as an example, there are species that have not been found for a very long time, subspecies. Our top finding from this combined assessment includes the fact that several of the top taxa have not been seen for 30 years or more and are in extremely vulnerable locations or are also almost considered extinct. And I could give examples of that near the top. There are a large number of endemic Lycaenidae, that is the blues, coppers, and hair streaks, especially in that particular genus that I mentioned at the very beginning of the talk, Euphalotes, that are highly ranked. And California and Nevada have high numbers of at-risk taxa here. So just as a general conclusion, if you are attending and involved in either of those states, there are high numbers. The last thing that I want to mention is that there are a mix of protected and largely unprotected taxa in this top 50 that you can see on the graph here to the right. Taxa subspecies with a single star are federally protected, either threatened or endangered. And the Nokomis fritillary subspecies here is under review for protection at the moment. But you can see that they are intermixed, especially in the top 25, with a large number of subspecies that are not protected federally. And many of these, especially that are in Intermountain West states, do not have state level protections afforded to them either, because their departments of wildlife do not regulate many classes of terrestrial invertebrates. So I want to take just a second, because there are so many imperiled subspecies, I want to take a second and just highlight some of the things that are in common with them and just give you a brief overview of this. And so this is what that's meant to be. For those of you that are familiar with nature serve ranks, I have listed them here just as a reminder. A 1 ranking is highly imperiled, a 5 ranking is secure. And you can see here that this list of species that we have in the 4 corner states is dominated by Lycaenids, the blues, coppers, and hair streaks, and the brushfoot butterflies, the nymphalids, the family that has the monarch butterfly in it. You can also see that it includes 2 federally protected taxa, the Leonard skipper and the Uncompahgre fritillary. Again, just highlighting other commonalities, I want to point out 3 subspecies that have been absent from the records for a long period of time. That includes the desert yucca borer that's found outside of the Phoenix area, and Anesia checker spot found in the corner of northeast Arizona, northwest New Mexico, and the silver bordered fritillary. Then we move on to some more established documented threats throughout the Western United States. And I want to explain that there's no firm methodology behind which species are highlighted here, and they may be threatened by fire in different ways. Just as an example, the Virgin Mountains Mojave blue listed here is threatened mainly because of the increase in invasive grasses in its habitat, followed by an increase in fire regime. Whereas the Oregon Mountains poling hair streak is actually more likely threatened by a suppression of fire that changes its habitat, followed by extreme wildfires that are much hotter than is typical. So you can see that there may be a mix of threats involved in this idea of wildfire threats. Of course, wildfire by itself is typically not detrimental to butterfly populations on the whole. Development, as I mentioned at the very beginning, many areas of the West are subjected to large amounts of development, and I have highlighted some of those species here, including the Nokomis fritillary under review for protection, as well as a variety of other subspecies that some of you may be familiar with. Again, if you are familiar with butterfly taxonomy in these areas, you can see these butterflies, no matter which ones are highlighted, many of them are spread out over multiple states and are ranked very highly as being imperiled by multiple state natural heritage programs. Recreation, not exactly similar, not totally different from threats from development, but I'll just point out some species like the Emmel's pallid dotted blue here live on very isolated sand dune habitats. And while these may not be near areas that are being developed for human populations, they are highly recreated areas for off-road vehicles. So that may be some of the things that puts them at risk. And then lastly, as you may expect, many species are going to be at risk because of drought. And I have highlighted them here. And again, the causes of this risk may be slightly varied. For example, the Virgin Mountains blue may be capable of spending multiple years as a pupa, hanging out, waiting for its annual buckwheat plants to emerge from the ground in a wet year. But it is very unclear what an extended drought of 5 or 10 years would mean for that butterfly. And so that's why I have highlighted it here. I just want to take a second and highlight one species that I've already mentioned briefly that is kind of a sad poster child for all of these threats. This is the Virgin Mountains Mojave blue. I've shown its very isolated distribution here on this map to the right. All of its populations are expected to be on public lands. It's not been seen since 2008, so it's very difficult to know exactly what its status is. It feeds only on annual buckwheats, 2 or 3 species of them, maybe a 4th one. One of them is here. This is the bird's nest buckwheat. It's very pretty, fragile buckwheat that grows in very rocky soil in the lower portions of sandy washes and canyons in southeast Nevada, northwest Arizona, and southern Utah. And this habitat places this butterfly at a number of different, subject to a number of different threats, including, as I mentioned, non-native annual grass invasion, followed by increased fire frequency, as well as possibly excessive livestock grazing, large numbers of off-road vehicles near its habitat, drought in the area, and a lack of current information. So with my last couple minutes, I'd like to summarize, and I'll start with the sad news here first, which is that many butterfly species do appear to be in decline across the Western United States. Some of this conclusion is based on really, really well vetted long-term count data for up to 178 widespread species. And this includes the entire range for many of these species. Species in the Southwest and California appear to be at particular risk, partly because of urbanization and other documented threats, partly because of the emerging effects of warming in the autumn season and drought caused by climate change. And the threats that these butterflies face are going to be similar across widespread species. And I have listed some of these here. These are threats that are found across a wide part of the Western US, and so are likely to affect many species at once. And then I'm going to end on some of the good. I think the thing that is most important to note here is that there are many opportunities for combined conservation. Widespread species can be protected by anyone. This is similar to the monarch butterfly. Its wide distribution and the ability of us to put plants in the ground and not use pesticides where we find wildlife allow anyone to make a difference. So I would encourage you to take that away today. Anybody can go and look for these butterflies, especially because most of them are found all over the place in urban and agricultural edges. And those of you that are outside California, especially in the desert Southwest, play an important role in monitoring and beginning to understand the status of these at-risk populations of butterflies. And then when it comes to on-the-ground restoration, they share their habitats, including urban, rural, and agricultural settings, woodland areas, and near riparian habitats. And their host plants often overlap, allowing us to provide crucial habitat for multiple species at once by planting very simple things like grasses or native amaranths or mallows that are pretty and have good wildlife value and aesthetic value as well. And then when it comes to really reducing the threats that they face through our actions, whether it's insecticide or herbicide exposure, protecting existing populations, or planting nectar plants, I'd encourage you to visit the Xerces Society. Our pesticide and native pollinator programs have enormous amounts of resources available to you for doing general practices that will encourage all native pollinators to thrive in your areas. And then lastly, I want to point out some of the content that I personally am working on right now that will be for audiences across the Western United States. I am taking some of these top declining species and I am prioritizing their records. I'm cleaning all of these records. You can see on the right, I have a slightly more resolved map for locations of the WestCoast Lady. And I'm creating detailed species profiles. So that will incorporate the information I have talked about today, habitat requirements, their biology and life cycle, their distribution and the threats that they face, as well as, very importantly, detailed management guidance and survey protocols to help understand the status of these species across their range. And with that, I would like to thank Matt Forrester for his collaboration through this project. And I am extraordinarily grateful for the funding support that we've been given from our Xerces Society members and through the Newland Foundation that has funded this webinar and much of the research that I have just talked about. And with that, I will say thank you, and I am happy to take questions that anyone might have.
Thank you, Kevin. That was great. That was a lot of information. I learned a lot. So if folks have questions, please use the Q&A icon or the chat at this point. It's a quiet audience this morning.
Still somewhat early on the West Coast, I suppose.
Yeah, that's true. I'm going to ask you probably a really hard question while we're waiting to see if any questions come in. Do you have a favorite butterfly?
My favorite butterfly. Well, that is a hard question. I think I'm going to go with the one that we just recently found, that talking about things that are dry and things that can survive multiple years of drought. We have been looking for a subspecies of small blue, Phyllotiella speciosa. I showed a different subspecies of that. And that butterfly feeds on annual buckwheats in dry, sandy washes at the low ends of canyons in central Nevada. And it is a place where you only get good wildflowers every few years. And this is a good year for that. I drove through and I saw a dozen species of flowers in that canyon that I have never seen. And we found the subspecies of butterfly there for the first time searching in 4 seasons. So that's definitely a new favorite right now.
Wow, that's exciting. I love that that came with a story.
Yeah, that's very exciting for me. I can't get that butterfly out of my head right now. It's very good. Very good fun.
Okay, we have a couple questions. Someone's asking for clarification when you were talking about fires. Were you talking about wildfires or prescribed burns?
Typically, when I am talking about threats to butterflies, I am referring to wildfires. And it's not, I also will just emphasize again, it's not any wildfire. It's typically the change in the wildfire frequency or intensity or some other characteristic that takes it out of its what we call natural fire regime And those are often things like a huge increase in fuels laying on the ground because the fire has been suppressed for a long time, or the disappearance of open habitat because of the suppression of fire for a long time. Or in the case of the Mojave Mountains, the Virgin Mountains Mojave Blue that I mentioned, because it's typically has a very, very low fire frequency, and you have an introduction of non-native plants that then change that. So those are the types of wildfire threats. Prescribed burns, because of their patchiness, low intensity, those are usually beneficial on the whole.
Okay, thank you. Another question, do you use any community science data from iNaturalist in this research?
Yeah, good question. I definitely use community data science from iNaturalist, and I'll also emphasize that Matt Forrester uses it too. So for the count side of things, or in this latest study, we're actually using iNaturalist data to infer range changes in range sizes. He uses iNaturalist data for that. I definitely use iNaturalist data when I am pulling in records of butterflies. And those records are also incorporated into the larger databases like that GBIF database that I mentioned. The research grade observations of iNaturalist go into that as well. And I pull separate from there too. And as you can tell, I use their pictures all the time as well. So I should not minimize that aspect of iNaturalist. Yeah, definitely.
And other than iNaturalist, are there other citizen science projects that's related to these imperiled butterflies that people can get involved in?
That's a great question. So one of the other places you can submit butterflies for identification and store them as records is the database that I mentioned earlier, the Butterflies and Moths of North America. It's abbreviated BAMONA. That is a great database for expert identifications, especially if you have something you think is a little funny and you want to send it to somebody that is a dedicated regional expert. That's a great database to go to. If you are interested in monitoring butterflies and doing perhaps a more rigorous study, there is an organization that's called Pollard Base, and they have regional butterfly monitoring programs that monitor the same site up to 6 or more times through a season for butterfly abundance and diversity. So it's a different type of program than the 4th of July butterfly count, which is once a year. This is a program where you go back to the same site several times through a year. And I would highly encourage people to do that if they're interested. And there are the 4th of July butterfly counts, which is just a once a year thing. If you want to go out with a group of individuals, some of which will be local experts, and count butterflies with them, that's another great way to contribute.
Awesome. So we have another question about plant lists for urban gardens and whether or not they're too general or kind of the same common species over and over, and not some of the more rare host plants are butterflies that are doing better because of gardens, maybe swallowtails, for example.
Swallowtails are a good example. They are doing really well. I did not show that graph on this presentation, but swallowtails are actually increasing in abundance at some sites across the US. So they are an interesting example. The host plants question is an interesting one. It is fairly important to pick plants that are, what I should say is you will be more likely to have butterflies lay eggs and be successful with caterpillars on plants that are found in your local area. There is a certain amount of local recognition for that. That said, especially the butterflies that I have mentioned are a little bit more flexible in the sorts of plants that they will lay on. Not entirely so, especially not the little endemic subspecies, but the widespread species that I focused on, and things especially that feed on grasses will often feed on numbers of different grasses. And so there is some research to be done there, but also, just as an example, if you have any type of mallow in your yard, a WestCoast Lady has some likelihood of laying an egg on it. They are a generalist in enough of the sense that down to the genus is a decent chance of getting them to lay eggs in your yard. So there is a range of that flexibility for these species. I think that Xerxes has some of the best regional resources for choosing butterfly host plants. They have done their research, and so I would encourage you to go back to the Attracting Native Pollinators and Gardening with Butterflies books. Both of those will have lists of host plants that are regionally acceptable to butterflies in the area.
Okay, great. So we have another question about survey protocols, just because with different surveys being specific to different species and their needs and habitat and the goals of the survey, and they're asking, will there be a team, which would probably involve local experts, to look at how best to monitor for species or how these differences are going to be considered? For example, there are already monitoring protocols for at least one species on the rare list. Just wanted to make sure that their efforts are coordinated.
I appreciate that. So we will be, our in-depth species profiles will have species-specific survey protocols with them. So hopefully that alleviates that need. We will adapt each of those protocols to that. And I certainly am making very specific instructions for the taxa that have very specific life cycles. For example, something like the Virgin Mountains Mojave Blue that might overwinter for multiple seasons, that needs to be noted as far as survey efforts. On the other hand, not that this is a total answer, but I am going to fall back on the idea that some of these species, especially the ones that are common in weedier areas or in urban areas as well, are often part of multi-species mixes, and so can be found using a more generalized protocol like a pollard-based protocol where you wander along a pathway in a kind of confined area looking for butterflies. That's a very adequate way to look for some of these more widespread species. But that said, each of the taxa that I am going to have a profile on has species-specific survey